The 1930s were a groundbreaking, yet strange time for archaeology. In that decade before radiocarbon dating, though the elaborate three-age system proposed by the Danes in the 19th century had established the rough chronology of prehistory we still use today, very little was concretely known about the actual dates involved. Though innumerable scholars dedicated their entire lives to developing strict dating systems based on ceramics alone, their estimates would ultimately often turn out to be wrong by thousands of years. The past being much deeper than the pre-radiocarbon dating scholars could ever have imagined. And yet, the 1930s was an age of immense discovery. Influential prehistorian Gordon Childe first proposed his idea of the Neolithic Revolution as the instigator of agricultural societies, and by extension, our world today. And in 1939, early medieval studies were completely revolutionised by the discovery of the Sutton Hoo burial. And yet, on mainland Europe, the storm clouds of war gathered. The shape of things to come remaining extremely uncertain. There would be no future for many of Europe's nations, let alone a past. In a pseudo-archaeological frenzy, Heinrich Himmler's cabal of Nazi scholars roamed the world seeking evidence of a powerful Germanic past. And in Britain too, an ancient past was being sought. In 1939, just on the cusp of the all-consuming world conflict that would define the century, excavations would begin at one of Britain's most famous and immaculately preserved Iron Age hill forts. A great citadel of the ancients, the likes of which is rarely seen today. This is Old Oswestry. Named for the famous Northumbrian hero king of the early Middle Ages, whose last great battle was fought near here at Maserfield in 642, vying for dominance against a coalition of Mercians and Welshmen. After the battle, Oswald's battered corpse was dismembered, sent to the four corners of the realm by Penda, last great pagan ruler of the Anglo-Saxons. His head allegedly was left on a pole here for a year. And the Welshmen, whose ancestors had ruled here for thousands of years, were led by Cythlen, said to be the last descendant of King Arthur to rule in the Welsh Marches. And that isn't the only Arthurian connection, for this too was said to be the homeland of Guinevere. Perhaps an evolution of an ancient Brythonic queen, Ganhumara. Old Oswestry, sometimes called the Stonehenge of the Iron Age, has a storied past. But most importantly, for archaeologist William Varley, by 1939, its ramparts survived well enough to be excavated. A Yorkshire geologist and amateur archaeologist, Varley had no funding to carry out his work. Digs then almost always being undertaken by independently wealthy individuals. and his research wouldn't be published until the 1990s, long after his death. And yet, today, his scholarship is well regarded, providing fascinating and important insights into this historic site. It turned out that the place hadn't been built all at once, but in 4 distinct phases of construction, spanning nearly 1,000 years. Unfortunately, this blockbuster hill fort, one of the finest in the country, now stands at great risk by encroaching housing developers. If nothing is done, it seems increasingly unlikely it will survive the next 100 years, let alone 1,000. My name's Pete Kelly. From windswept Scotland to the wild valleys of Cornwall, I've made it my mission to visit the hill forts of our ancestors and to tell their stories, bringing you along for the ride. In the summer of 2021, I stopped by briefly here at Old Oswestry to have a look. This is what I found. On the 4th of November 1918, just days before the end of the Great War, 25-year-old poet Wilfred Owen is cut down in battle whilst leading his men into combat on the battlefields of France. In Oswestry, as the church bells rang a week later, to mark the end of the war, Owen's mother was informed of his passing. During the previous year, in a frenzy of creative energy, having taken it upon himself to speak out about the plight of the men under his command, Owen had produced some of the most lauded poems of the war. Just one of many attempting to make sense of that shattering of a generation. Early in the war, Owen had trained at Oswestry, learning the art of trench warfare in the massive ramparts. His fate inexplicably tied up with the place. Though Owen had only spent a few years of his life there, his family had deep roots, going back many generations. His grandfather had once been mayor of the town. It wasn't the first time war had come to Oswestry, not by a long shot. The place was infused with battle. Unfortunately, when William Varley arrived at the place in the early 1930s to begin serious archaeological work, he found great damage had been done during the war, when the Park Hall training camp had been based nearby. Trenches were cut and explosives used to create shallow craters, many of which today can be mistaken for archaeological features, and much of the centre of the fort had been damaged. And yet, the place was so massive that Varley was able to conduct significant work there nonetheless. Just too young to be in the war, but living in a decade defined by its shadow, Varley attended university in Aberystwyth in the mid-1920s. going on to lecture in the 1930s at Liverpool. In 1932, when invited to dig with Gordon Childe at the Old Keeg Stone Circle in Scotland, Varley began his serious archaeological career. At Childe's encouragement, Varley soon went on to instigate his first independent dig at the Bronze Age Bleasdale Circle in Lancashire. The only known timber circle at the time where any wood had survived. His next project in 1934, which in a recent reappraisal has been called meticulous for the time, was at the hill forts of Cheshire. The first digs carried out by any archaeologist in the county. Dating Bickerton Hill to between the 2nd centuries and 1st century AD. Next was Edisbury Hill Fort. Employing unemployed Liverpool dock workers to help him in a work scheme in the summers of 1936, 37 and 38, where he used cutting-edge techniques, placing him at the forefront of the field in 1930s Britain. And finally, teaming up with H.J. O'Neill, who'd also independently excavated 3 hill forts in the Welsh Marches during the previous decade. In 1939, he turned his attention to Old Oswestry. Unfortunately, many archaeologists have a tendency of not publishing their results, and Varley's only surfaced in the 1990s, long after his death. Why this happened is difficult to say, but it's also difficult to overstate the fundamental change in almost every echelon of society that the Second World War had. Archaeology and many other fields of science moved forward immensely due to the new technologies developed as a byproduct of the conflict. By the 50s, archaeology was a modern science using cutting-edge radiocarbon technology. Varley was from an older time. He was a prolific excavator, but not much of a writer or a researcher. And after his wartime service was up in 1946, he, like everyone else having served in some capacity, moved to Ghana with his new wife. As Varley excavated 15th and 16th century Ghanaian forts, Oswestry was at the back of his mind. And after his death in 1976, most of his research was thought to have been lost. But in the 1990s, it resurfaced. And other work has been done since. William Varley was very interested in disseminating archaeological knowledge to the public. So here's to you, William Varley. Here's my attempt to do the same. Standing on the top of Old Oswestry, panoramic views stretch out across North and Mid Wales, Cheshire and Shropshire. Even though a shroud of mist fell upon much of the surrounding land when I visited in the summer of 2021, visibility was still excellent. And back when this place was in its heyday, some 2,500 years ago, the entire surrounding landscape seems to have been settled too. Aerial photography in recent decades having revealed Iron Age settlements and field systems ranging all around. Surplus food from these farms could have supported a proto-kingship here at the fort, maybe even supplying the labour to build and repair the place, which perhaps acted as a refuge in times of war. Flint tools and stone axes suggest a long habitation up here, stretching far back into the Neolithic. Prominent hills often being favoured by the Stone Age first farmers of Britain. The first direct evidence of a settlement, however, dates to around 1000 BC, at the end of the Bronze Age, just before the first ramparts were built. Celtic Iron Age Britain was a land divided into many tribal territories, sharing a similar culture and religion, but often very different political structures. There is no doubt in my mind, and in the minds of many archaeologists, that Old Oswestry was a major stronghold and probable tribal capital for one of those groups. Either the Cornovii or the Ordovices. Though such is the loss of memory from that time, it's difficult to say which. This is just one of many multi-valid hill forts in a dense band on the Welsh Marches and eastern Wales. One of the places in Britain to have the most hill forts of all. The massive ditches and banks would have been formidable obstacles for anyone coming here. But perhaps also constructed for display and dominance as much as actual military need. Where sheep graze today, and the grass stands tall and unkempt in the centre of the fort, a large number of roundhouses once scattered. Each house probably built using wooden posts with wattle and daub walls. A central post supporting a thatched roof and a hearth inside. Light metalworking activities were found within the fort too. Activities usually associated with kingly or chiefly power. Varley quickly noted that there had been several stages of construction at the site. It's perhaps obvious from the sheer complexity of the place, having developed over hundreds of years, suggesting immense importance associated with it by generation after generation. They simply kept coming back, or maybe they never left. In the earliest phase, a mere scattering of huts existed on an undefended hill. By around the 7th century BC, these were surrounded by a double bank of ramparts, with entrances at the east and west sides, creating large gateways. During this time, several shards of pottery were found, which had been imported from the Wiltshire area, as well as salt containers from Cheshire. Both areas that also had massive hill forts, and demonstrating long-distance trade links. Later still, yet more defences were added. If only we could tell some of the stories from this clearly important community. the lives that they led. Later still, yet more defences were added, perhaps in anticipation of attack during a time of war. A third bank surrounding all sides except the southeast, where the steep incline of the hill made it unnecessary. Finally, in the next few centuries, the western entrance was rebuilt with massive ridges and outworks. The eastern entrance was also strengthened with 2 further circuits of banks and ditches. The place became the monster we see today. And it would have been even more impressive in its prime. And then, in the 1st century AD, it all came to an end. Just like everywhere else they conquered, when the Romans came to Britain, Iron Age hill forts fell out of use. The new imperial overlords couldn't have their British taxpayers hiding out in places like that. They needed them in towns being productive. But when the Romans left, some 350 years later, a strange phenomenon took place. The long-oppressed Britons looking back to those forts of antiquity. Old Oswestry was incorporated into the defences of Wat's Dyke, a number of linear earthworks that stretch across the Welsh borders, the most famous of which being Offa's Dyke. By the Mercian kingdom, which soon grew up in these parts. This is around the time when the legend of Guinevere being associated with the site may have originated. And the place looms large in the mythology of this region. Since being made a scheduled monument in 1934, Old Oswestry has been carefully managed and is free to visit today. And yet, it's not safe. We live in an age where profits often get placed over heritage. Since 2015, housing developers have sought planning permission to create new houses near the slopes of the fort. Shropshire County Council denies that the plan to create 27,500 new homes in the area will harm the hill fort. But an ongoing campaign of locals and archaeologists, including Sir Barry Cunliffe, think that the government is testing the waters to see what they can get away with.
We only have to look to Clatchard Craig in Scotland.
One of the finest Pictish forts in existence, destroyed for profit in the 50s and 60s, turned into railway tracks by the Ministry of Transport. Think of the wonders that could have been found at that fort. Only a handful being found anywhere. Adding it to Burghead, which was already destroyed.
As well as Coigan Camp, Dinorban, and many, many more. Only recently in the 1990s, Hen Gastell in southern Wales had a motorway built directly through it. Time and time again, as we've seen in both Britain and all over the world, if companies can get away with destroying our past for profit, they will.
These forts aren't necessarily for us, but for the generations that come later. The stand must be made here. Leave Old Oswestry alone.